So sometimes cozy relationships between members of the media and subjects can bring you fruitful information, right? But when those cozy relationships with somebody like Jeffrey Epstein end up being more of a cover-up than transparency, we have a serious problem, don't we? And there have been rumors about relationships between people in the media and Donald Trump and how that has inured to Trump's benefit. Because access is powerful, isn't it? And we're talking a lot about access by mainstream and legacy media figures to folks like Donald Trump, Jeffrey Epstein, and others. Because I think it informs and it frames how our members of the media are approaching how they cover these subjects. And here's a perfect example. There's a financial journalist who used to work at the New York Times by the name of Landon Thomas Jr. Now, you may not have ever heard of him unless maybe you were covering or you were thinking about or dealing with financial issues. But he was at the Times for a number of years, and his name has now come forward in the Epstein Files in very alarming ways. And let me be very clear. I am not suggesting in any way, shape, or form that Landon Thomas Jr. himself participated in any of the pedophilia, the child sex trafficking, the child sex abuse. In some ways, what Landon Thomas Jr. did was clearly not as bad, but bad. And the reason why is I've gone through the files and I continue to go through the files, but I have lots of emails and communications by and between Landon Thomas Jr. and Jeffrey Epstein. And I'm going to go through some of them because I want to highlight to you exactly how much of a failure in ethics and journalistic integrity has happened here. So much so that information not only about Jeffrey Epstein, but also about Donald Trump could have come out years before the 2016 presidential election, years before the Access Hollywood tape, years before any prospect announced in 2015 that Trump was going to run for president of the United States. So let's go through this because it's also relevant to what's happening in England right now. So let's start here. I got an email here, January 19th, 2012. And it is from Jeffrey Epstein to Landon Thomas, and they're talking about somebody, some Norwegian person, but then here we go. Landon Thomas tells Jeffrey Epstein, look what I got. And it's a message. Dear Mr. Landon, hello, please, I would like to speak with you regarding an article you published in 2005 about Jeffrey Epstein. Thank you sincerely. And the name is redacted. And then Epstein says, smart man. Landon says to Jeffrey Epstein, smart man, I was going to mention this to you, but got sidetracked. Got an email this summer from this woman below. I never connected with her. Is she one of your tormentors? Now, this is 4 years after Jeffrey Epstein has taken his sweetheart plea deal in Florida. 4 years after any plausible deniability, right, ever ceased about people knowing what Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell were about. And yet Landon Thomas Jr., because he's been cultivating this connection with Jeffrey Epstein, who's wealthy and is rubbing elbows with the rich and the famous and the uber wealthy, and Landon Thomas Jr., being a financial journalist, wants to be able to rub elbows as well and have access to the movers and the shakers, the people that I call the masters of the universe when it comes to commerce and finance and business. So to sell his soul, Landon Thomas Jr. says, you know what, let me have this ingratiating, totally obsequious, ass-kissing relationship with Jeffrey Epstein because I get access to people and I get access to information that I otherwise would not be privy to. But Landon Thomas Jr. goes one step further, right? Calling a young woman who reaches out to him to share information with him about Jeffrey Epstein. He calls her a, quote, tormentor, end quote, of Jeffrey Epstein. So what is the article that this young woman is referencing? Well, back in 2005, Landon Thomas Jr. cemented himself as being kind of the guy who knew something about Jeffrey Epstein because he did this piece in The New Yorker. And you're going to fall out of your chair when I read you what the title was of this. Ready? The New York Magazine, it was New York Magazine, and it was a 2002 New York profile. It was the first recorded interaction between Landon Thomas Jr. and Jeffrey Epstein. The New York Magazine story was entitled International Money Man of Mystery. And according to The Intercept, it was written in a, quote, glamorous, gossipy style. But it also references evidence that Donald Trump knew something about Jeffrey Epstein's obsession with underage girls. And what are we talking about? This quote. Landon Thomas quotes convicted felon Donald Trump about Jeffrey Epstein as follows. Quote, I've known Jeff for 15 years. Terrific guy. He's a lot of fun to be with. It is even said that he likes beautiful women as much as I do, and many of them on the younger side. Thomas used that quote in his New York Magazine article. And listen, that's what people are saying is let's look at that as evidence that Trump knew that Epstein had this predilection for young girls. And of course, Donald Trump in that quote is basically saying what? Donald Trump is basically saying, yeah, he likes beautiful women as much as I do. I mean, it's disgusting. But so Thomas kind of cements himself in this space as kind of this authority on Epstein, right? And so thus begins this relationship between Thomas and Epstein. Then, January 6, 2015. I mean, I just cherry-picked some of these emails and cherry-picked not in a convenient way, but just to give you some highlights here. Thomas reaches out to Epstein. How are you holding up is the subject. Jeffrey Epstein says, sunny, January 6, 2015. Landon Thomas says, good, don't let the bastards get you down. And in a kind of disturbing exchange, on January 22nd, 2015, Landon Thomas Jr. emails Jeffrey Epstein, I just read VR's deposition. Heavy stuff. What does she want in the end? Money? Epstein says, fame. Landon Thomas responds, are you still going to lay low and take all this crap? Epstein says, time will come soon. Thomas replies, okay, good luck. Then Epstein says, any suggestions? To which Landon Thomas Jr. on January 23rd, 2015 is giving advice to child sex predator, child sex abuser, pedophile Jeffrey Epstein the following. I think you need to find some TV guy and just open yourself up. If she is lying, then say so. But also say you did a lot of stupid stuff that you now regret. Because what she says becomes truth, and the more you lay low, the worse it gets. You have to change the narrative. It won't be easy or fun, but you have to show world you are not a deranged pedophile. This is not going to go away. Despite Donald Trump saying we need to move on, Landon Thomas actually was right back in January of 2015. This is not going to go away. But what kind of disturbing advice is this being given to a pedophile by Landon Thomas Jr.? March of 2015, here's evidence. Landon Thomas Jr. was hitting up Jeffrey Epstein for donations to organizations and things that Landon Thomas Jr. wanted to get financial support. And this becomes relevant because it's one of the reasons why Landon Thomas Jr. no longer works at the New York Times. But we'll get to that in a second. December 8th, 2015. Now here's an incredible exchange between Landon Thomas Jr. and Jeffrey Epstein. December 8th, 2015. Landon Thomas Jr. emails Jeffrey Epstein. Now everybody coming to me thinking I have juicy info on you and Trump because of this. Quote, I've known Jeff for 15 years. Terrific guy. Trump booms from a speakerphone. He's a lot of fun to be with. It is even said that he likes beautiful women as much as I do, and many of them are on the younger side. No doubt about it. Jeffrey enjoys his social life. End quote. That story will never die. Epstein says, would you like photos of Donald and girls in bikinis in my kitchen? Thomas Jr. Yes. Epstein says, Hawaiian tropic girl, Lauren Petrella. Then Thomas Jr. responds, I am a serious man. For the good of the nation, why not try to get some of this out there? I would not do it myself, but would pass it on to a political reporter. Plus, look at these lies. And he's citing to statements by Trump's general counsel, Alan Garden, threatening legal action against BuzzFeed News about Trump's connection to Epstein, wherein Garden lies and says Trump's only connection with Epstein was that Epstein was one of thousands of people who has visited Mar-a-Lago. That's it. Mr. Trump has never been accused of having any involvement or even having any knowledge of any of Mr. Epstein's conduct by anyone. Epstein then says, redacted, my 20-year-old girlfriend in 93. That after 2 years I gave to Donald, as in he gave the girl to Donald. And instead of saying, this is disgusting, what are you doing, Jeffrey Epstein, Landon Thomas Jr. says, amazing, when is last time you talked to him? And then House Oversight got an email exchange also on that same date where Epstein says to Landon Thomas Jr. regarding Trump, read the BuzzFeed regarding my airplane logs and Hawaiian Tropic contest. I have them ask my houseman about Donald Trump, almost walking through the door, leaving his nose print on the glass as young women were swimming in the pool, and he was so focused he walked straight into the door. Ever wonder about Alan Dershowitz? According to Landon Thomas Jr., December 15, 2015, Mr. Dershowitz says he's no longer friendly with Mr. Epstein. Really? To which Jeffrey Epstein says Dershowitz cannot tell the truth on any issue. February 10th, 2016. Regarding Trump, Landon Thomas Jr. emails Jeffrey Epstein. It's getting scary. The stories you could tell. Jeffrey Epstein says, wow. And then Landon Thomas Jr. responds, actually, I don't think he/voters would care. Being effectively shameless is a pretty powerful weapon for a presidential candidate. May 16th, 2016. I'm kind of shocked that our reporters did not contact you regarding the Trump/women story. Seems to me he got off rather lightly. How are you doing? And then Epstein says, me too. Me too? As in, kind of shocked. I'm also shocked that the reporters didn't contact you regarding that. June 1st, 2016. Now, remember, Trump is not in office yet. We haven't even had our November 2016 election yet, right? Landon Thomas Jr. emails Jeffrey Epstein. I keep getting calls from that guy doing a book on you, John Connolly. He seems very interested in your relationship with the news medium. I told him you were a hell of a guy, smiley face. Did you ever speak to him? Jeffrey Epstein writes, no. Are you still getting calls from reporters regarding Trump? Thomas Jr. asks. Epstein responds, every day. Landon Thomas Jr. then says, everyone except the New York Times, it seems, smiley face emoji. Yes or no question, does he win? To which Epstein responds, ask me August, as in ask me in August of 2016. But think about this. Everyone except the New York Times is reaching out to Jeffrey Epstein about Donald Trump, even though there is an established relationship between Epstein and Trump. And even though Landon Thomas Jr. is clearly privy to shit about Donald Trump, because there's a lot of emails that have been released by the DOJ that shows that Landon Thomas Jr. will either initiate or poke Jeffrey Epstein for info about something, to which Epstein says, call me, and gives a number. So Epstein's smart, right? Not all of it is in written communication form. So who would know information about Donald Trump and Epstein? Landon Thomas Jr. Has House Oversight reached out to Landon Thomas Jr. to subpoena him to get his deposition? Nah. But the Clintons are the fucking priority, right? September 2016, we're inching our way to the November election. Landon Thomas Jr. writes on September 16th, I'm getting worried. Is he ever going to implode? Epstein says, too late. Landon, you think he will win? Epstein, ask again on the 30th. Landon, if you knew Trump was going to win, how would you position your portfolio? Jeffrey Epstein, give me a number, I'll call. To which Landon Thomas Jr. gives a phone number. That's what we care about, right? We care about where your portfolio is going to be, Jeffrey Epstein. February 17, 2017, Landon Thomas Jr. is giving notice to Jeffrey Epstein over the years when Epstein's name is popping up or when something about Epstein is popping up. And in this email, Landon Thomas Jr. says, here we go again. And he references a Politico story about Alexander Acosta, the Southern District of Florida U.S. attorney, who was then over that sweetheart plea deal stuff where the feds didn't prosecute Epstein. To which Jeffrey Epstein says, fun. Now, March 3rd, 2017, Trump has now been elected. He's been sworn in January of 2017. But you remember how Alan Garden's like, there's no evidence that any contact was ever made other than Epstein going to Mar-a-Lago like thousands of other people? Jeffrey Epstein telling Landon Thomas Jr., March 3rd, 2017, Donald arrives at 5 p.m. tonight, referencing Donald Trump. Arrives at your home? Why is Donald Trump going to your home? January 3rd, 2018. We're now solidly into his first term, Donald Trump. Jeffrey Epstein writes to Landon Thomas Jr., sending him a New York Magazine article about Michael Wolff's book, Fire and Fury, about Donald Trump. Landon Thomas Jr. says, I know, have been reading it. Good old MW, Michael Wolff. You still talk to him? Epstein says, yup. Landon Thomas Jr. responds, no doubt he and DT, Donald Trump, know each other well too. Have to say he is looking/sounding increasingly unhinged, as in Donald Trump. Are you tempted to take any money off the table in the markets? Again, Landon Thomas Jr. still trying to angle to use his connections to Jeffrey Epstein to get inside track info on the financial markets. Jeffrey Epstein says no, but no questions. Donald's statement is goofy. Early dementia, ? Landon Thomas Jr. responds, you be the judge. Wasn't here a time when he at least completed sentences? To which Jeffrey Epstein responds, no, he was always stupid. This is January 3rd, 2018. August 16th, 2018. Landon Thomas Jr. says to Jeffrey Epstein, thanks for doing that, by the way. Made me look good to the bosses again. Jeffrey Epstein responds, of course. So some type of favor is done that inures to Landon Thomas Jr.'s benefit at the New York Times. And then in a just very disgusting, let me pull on this thread for a second, I found in the DOJ release at one of the bait stamps, 156754, an entire article from 2013 entitled The Construct of Grooming and Child Sexual Abuse, Conceptual and Measurement Issues in the Journal of Child Sexual Abuse regarding child molesters grooming children and how the methods could actually not have a lack of consensus about what grooming entails and how it's important to devise an accurate definition of grooming to see if it's different than just normal adult-child interactions. Again, disgusting. Now, Michael Wolff is important to talk about because we've always talked about Michael Wolff before. But the reason why I want to talk about Michael Wolff is this. Because Michael Wolff, you know, there's been all these exchanges by and between Michael Wolff and Jeffrey Epstein. But, I want to bring this to your attention, okay? There's a few emails that I found in the DOJ release that I think is very important. There's the one that we know about, wherein on May 25th, 2016, Michael Wolff is trying to ask Jeffrey Epstein, I'm interviewing Donald Trump, anything you think I should ask? And as we know, Epstein gave him all of these different topics, including Trump shuttle, Hawaiian Tropic, mortgages, all this other stuff, bankruptcy, fine. Okay. But then December of 2018, Epstein initiates contact with Michael Wolff about an investigative piece and says to Michael Wolff, what should we do about this? To which Michael Wolff says, I'd like to game out everything, creating a structure for thinking this through. Definitely not a piecemeal response. Maybe figure out where we want to be and where we can reasonably get and work backwards. Maybe we do agree to do a big interview with you. With whom? Landon Thomas or something like that, but this has to be war gamed out. Epstein says, do you think we highlight that at the end of the day, it was prostitution, sex for money, a state crime with state laws? Wolff says, at this point, I don't think you can go legalistic. They've won the high ground. Young, vulnerable, poor girls. Epstein says, I'm aware. I'm thinking, what would Trump do? Wolff says, he never tries to explain. He denies, blames media, denigrates someone else. Wolff says, the claims are ludicrous and self-serving. Media is working with the other side's lawyers. This is all about Donald Trump. Wolff says, all about Donald Trump, the real villain. Okay. Now, I am actually going to wrap this episode now because I do want to talk about Peter Mandelson in the UK, and I think that actually merits an entirely separate episode. And it occurred to me while I was doing this that, one, this episode's running a little long, and two, I want to kind of give it the attention that it merits. So I'm going to wrap now with the following thoughts. Landon Thomas Jr. actually left the New York Times because he actually had to admit to his editors that he had a friendship with Jeffrey Epstein, including that he solicited a $30,000 donation for a local uptown New York charity. Putting aside, great that we're helping a New York charity, these types of ethical lapses are pretty fucking egregious. The New York Times wrote, Landon Thomas Jr. has not worked at the Times since early 2019 after editors discovered his failure to abide by our ethical standards. And the only reason why Thomas Jr. even disclosed this to his editors is because he was asked to interview Jeffrey Epstein for the New York Times in 2018, and he was forced to disclose his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein and the solicitation for donations. And by the way, it's not just the $30,000. Epstein also gave $500 to another thing that Landon Thomas Jr. hit up Jeffrey Epstein to donate to. I got to tell you something. Is it worth it in the media to be able to have this type of relationship with Jeffrey Epstein and to also hold close information about Donald Trump that you could reveal that Jeffrey Epstein has shared with you as a member of the media that really maybe could have determined the outcome of an election? It's not, is it? And it just goes to show how absolutely insidious it was, the way that Epstein would work these connections, especially with people in the media. Because we know that public perception sometimes is stronger than the reality of something, right? Than the actual truth of something. And now we're seeing it in real time. You have somebody who is not only warning Jeffrey Epstein when stories are popping up in the media about him, but also saying, look, I'm not going to be putting this out there because, I'm a financial guy, but let's put this in a political reporter space, but it never fucking happened. And then we see confirmation that the New York Times never followed up with Jeffrey Epstein about Donald Trump, even though it was well known by the New York Times that Donald Trump had this relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. It is just a failure on so many different levels of the victims and the survivors of Epstein, Maxwell, and others, but just a failure of the American people by the New York Times to make sure that we really knew, especially back then, when it would have been more contemporaneously relevant for Trump's run for office, and also just to be able to expose all of these systemic failures, not only in our judicial system and in law enforcement, but also in the way that we're handling people that have money and means and power and wealth and influence. Huge disappointment. Be mad, be outraged, demand accountability. I promise you an episode on Peter Mandelson, and it'll come very soon. Katie Phang here. We launched the Katie Phang News Channel in partnership with the Midas Touch Network so we could bring you the latest in legal and political news. Straight, no chaser. So if you're a fellow truth teller, hit that subscribe button and share the word about this channel so we can build a high information America together.